Hello everyone. Welcome to Realist Quill. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? The bustling port of New Orleans in the sweltering summer of 1974, where the Mississippi River meets the Gulf, carrying vessels from every corner of the world. That's where my grandmother, everyone called her May, worked as one of the first female customs inspectors, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her meticulous ledgers becoming the stuff of legend among her male colleagues. The port reveals more secrets than any confessional. She'd tell us during our family gatherings at Willow Creek, her voice carrying the hint of a Cajun accent that grew stronger with each glass of bourbon. And those secrets don't always arrive in locked containers. One story she returned to often, the tale she called the Forgotten Cargo, began on a Tuesday unlike any other. The SS Meridian had docked after a journey from Istanbul, its manifest listing the usual textiles, spices, and handcrafted goods from throughout the Mediterranean. I had my routines, grandmother would explain, tapping her temple with one elegantly aged finger. 27 years on the docks taught me that patterns break before trouble arrives. That morning, the pattern broke. The captain of the Meridian, a Greek man named Stavros, with skin like tanned leather and eyes that had seen too much of the world, seemed oddly reluctant to complete the standard inspection. Small delays, unnecessary questions, documents suddenly misplaced only to be found moments later. When someone doesn't want you to go somewhere, grandmother would say, leaning forward so we could smell her signature scent of tobacco and jasmine. That's exactly where you need to look. She described how she deliberately moved against the flow of Stavros's suggestions, working her way deeper into the vessel's hold, until she reached a section that wasn't listed on the manifest at all. A small storage area sealed with a padlock that didn't match the ship's other lock. Something about that mismatched lock set off alarm bells, she'd say, mimicking the sound of an old-fashioned alarm with surprising vigor for a woman in her 80s. Like finding a diamond ring in a cereal box, it simply didn't belong. When she demanded the key, Stavros's facade crumbled. He claimed ignorance, insisted it must be a storage area for the crew's personal items. But grandmother had spent too many years sniffing out contraband to be fooled by amateur deception. I called for my colleagues, she'd continue, and we brought bolt cutters. Stavros looked like he might faint when that lock hit the floor with a clang that echoed through the hold like Judgment Day. The small compartment contained a single wooden crate, unmarked, approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. No shipping labels, no country of origin, nothing but raw wood and heavy-duty nails sealing it shut. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, grandmother would say, demonstrating with a shiver that seemed too genuine for mere storytelling. In all my years on the docks, I'd never felt such wrongness emanating from a container. They pried open the crate right there in the hold, each nail squealing in protest as it was forced from the wood. Inside, nestled in straw, was an ancient-looking stone statue about 3 feet tall, a seated figure with the body of a man and the head of a jackal. Its obsidian eyes seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. An Egyptian antiquity, grandmother would explain. Likely Anubis, guardian of the dead, stolen from some tomb or museum. Worth a fortune on the black market. But it wasn't the smuggling of antiquities that made this story one grandmother saved for late evenings when the younger cousins had gone to bed. It was what happened afterward. Within a week, 3 members of the team who had handled the statue fell seriously ill with symptoms no doctor could properly diagnose. High fever, vivid nightmares, and strange hieroglyphic-like rashes spreading across their torso. Coincidence? We told ourselves, grandmother would say, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. Just an unusual virus picked up from foreign cargo. Happens all the time in port cities. Then came the dream. Everyone who had touched the statue, including my grandmother, began experiencing the same nightmare, walking through an endless tomb pursued by something with padded feet and hot breath. Something that remained just outside their field of vision. I would wake up gasping, she admitted, my sheets soaked with sweat, the smell of desert sand somehow filling my New Orleans bedroom. The curator from the university who came to authenticate the statue added another layer to the growing unease. The artifact wasn't just any representation of Anubis. According to the hieroglyphs on its base, it came specifically from a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. A tomb whose excavation team had all died under mysterious circumstances. This particular statue, the curator explained to them, was said to serve as a vessel, a container that trapped a guardian spirit meant to pursue tomb robbers across time and distance. 2 weeks after the statue's discovery, the first death occurred. One of the customs officers who had helped open the crate was found in his home. No signs of struggle or forced entry. The coroner's report listed heart failure as the cause, though it couldn't explain the expression of terror frozen on the man's face, or the strange sand found in his lungs during autopsy. The second death came 3 days later. Another handler of the statue found similarly. By this point, panic had spread through the customs office. People requested transfers. Some simply quit. The statue was quickly transferred to a university research facility, locked away in climate-controlled storage. But moving the statue didn't stop what had been set in motion, grandmother would say, her usual animation replaced by a stillness that was somehow more frightening. The ancient Egyptians believed in justice that transcended time. Their curses weren't superstition, they were promise. My grandmother, pragmatic and scientific in most matters, did something completely out of character. She visited a Vodou priestess in the French Quarter, a woman known only as Madame Laveau, claiming descent from the famous Marie Laveau herself. I didn't believe, grandmother would insist, though the tremble in her hand contradicted her words. But I was desperate. Sometimes disbelief is a luxury you can't afford. Madame Laveau listened to the story in her dimly lit back room, surrounded by herbs and bones and items grandmother couldn't identify. When the tale was finished, the priestess didn't laugh or dismiss it. Instead, she closed her eyes and sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes. What follows you is not a curse, she finally said. It is a guardian doing exactly what it was created to do thousands of years ago. It follows the path of the stolen object, collecting those who have touched it, returning them to serve in the afterlife as they should have served in life as protectors of the dead. The solution, according to Madame Laveau, was both simple and nearly impossible. The statue needed to be returned to its original tomb with proper offerings and rituals of apology. As if the federal government would return a priceless antiquity based on the word of a Vodou priestess about a curse. Grandmother would scoff, though her eyes betrayed her fear. What followed was grandmother's most impressive feat in a career full of remarkable achievement. She began a quiet campaign, documenting the strange deaths, connecting with the Egyptian consulate, building a case that the statue's removal had unleashed some kind of toxic substance that was affecting those who handled it. Science, not superstition, became her public argument. Sometimes she'd tell us with a wink, "You have to speak the language people are willing to hear, even when you know the truth is speaking a different tongue altogether." It took 6 months of diplomatic negotiations, scientific consultations, and creative report writing. But eventually, the statue was created again, this time in a container marked with biohazard warnings, and returned to Egypt with a research team that had been thoroughly briefed on the potential toxic residue it might contain. Grandmother never learned exactly what happened when the statue was returned to its tomb. The American researchers were only allowed to accompany it as far as the Cairo Museum. Egyptian authorities handled the final journey, but the dream stopped the very night the statue left American soil. The strange illnesses afflicting the remaining handlers resolved within weeks. No more unexplained deaths occurred. Was it a curse? Grandmother would ask rhetorically, as she concluded her tale. Was it some ancient toxin embedded in the stone? Or was it simply the power of suggestion working on overstressed minds? The older I get, the less certain I am that these are different things. She would take a long sip of her bourbon then, letting the silence stretch until one of us inevitably asked if she still believed it was real. "What I believe," she would reply carefully, "is that there are forces in this world older and more patient than we can comprehend. Whether we call them curses, guardian spirits, or simply justice, they find their way home eventually." She never told this story the same way twice. Sometimes she emphasized the scientific explanations,
ancient mold spores or toxic residue from embalming chemicals. Other times she leaned into the supernatural elements, describing in chilling detail the jackal-headed figure that stalked her dream. Years later, after grandmother passed, I found among her effects a small leather journal. Inside, in her precise handwriting, was a detailed account of the Anubis incident, including names and dates I'd never heard in her oral rendition. The final entry, dated exactly 1 year after the statue's return to Egypt, contained only one line. "Tonight, for the first time in my dream, Anubis bowed to me before turning away."
The summer I turned 16. Grandmother May invited me to spend 6 weeks with her in New Orleans. My parents agreed, hoping her disciplined nature might straighten out what they called my creative relationship with rules. What none of us anticipated was that this visit would coincide with one of the strangest episodes in my grandmother's long career on the docks. It began, as many remarkable stories do, with something utterly ordinary. Paperwork. Grandmother had brought home a stack of manifests that needed review before a Norwegian cruise ship called the Aurora Borealis could disembark its passengers the following morning. Ship documenta are like reading tea leaves, she told me as we sat on her screened porch, the humid evening air heavy with jasmine and distant thunder. The story behind the journey is hidden in the discrepancy. I watched, fascinated despite myself, as her weathered finger moved down columns of numbers and inventory lists with the precision of a surgeon. Suddenly, she stopped, her eyebrow arching in that way that meant she'd found something interesting. 16 passengers boarded in Southampton, she murmured, but 17 are listed for disembarkation here. When I suggested a simple clerical error, grandmother fixed me with a look that made me feel about 5 years old. In 32 years checking manifests, I've learned there's no such thing as a simple error at sea, she said. Every inconsistency has a story behind it, and it's rarely a dull one. The next morning, I accompanied grandmother to the port, a rare privilege she arranged through decades of earned respect. The Aurora Borealis gleamed in the early light, its white hull immaculate against the muddy Mississippi water. "Keep your eyes open and your mouth closed," she instructed, as we boarded with the customs team. "Watch everything, question nothing, at least not until we're alone." The Norwegian captain, a towering man named Johansen with a beard white as Arctic ice, seemed unperturbed by grandmother's questions about the passenger discrepancy. He explained that an elderly woman had boarded at their last port of call in Bermuda, a late booking accommodated as a favor to the ship's owner. "Mrs. Helena Kraft," he said, consulting his own paperwork. "Widow of Henrik Kraft, the shipping magnate. She's in cabin You don't have a cabin 13, grandmother replied immediately. "No modern ship does. It's considered unlucky." The captain's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered in his pale eyes. "We make exceptions for those who specifically request it." As the inspection continued throughout the vessel, I noticed grandmother was leading us on a route that would eventually take us past the mysterious cabin. When we reached that corridor, I felt a distinct temperature drop, at least 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the ship. "Air conditioning fluctuations," one of the junior officers explained before we could ask. "Engineering is working on it." Cabin 13 looked like all the others from the outside, the same polished door, the same brass number. But unlike the other first-class cabins we'd inspected, this one was locked. "Mrs. Kraft values her privacy," the officer said smoothly. "She's elderly and uses these cruises to rest. The staff have standing instructions not to disturb her." I expected grandmother to insist, to invoke her authority as a federal customs inspector. Instead, she merely nodded and moved on, though I caught the slight narrowing of her eyes that meant the matter was far from set. Back in her office, grandmother made a series of phone calls to shipping authorities, to the cruise line's corporate office, and finally to someone she referred to only as an old friend at Interpol. "Helena Kraft doesn't exist," she told me after hanging up the final call. "Or rather, she did exist, but Henrik Kraft's widow died 3 years ago in Geneva."
That evening, we returned to the Aurora Borealis. Most passengers had disembarked for their New Orleans excursions, leaving the ship eerily quiet. Captain Johansen was conveniently unavailable, but grandmother's badge got us past the skeleton crew with minimal questions. "We're not doing anything illegal," she assured me when I expressed concern about our unauthorized return. "But we are definitely coloring outside the lines of protocol." The corridor leading to cabin 13 was even colder than before, our breath visible in small clouds as we approached the door. Grandmother knocked firmly. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Silent. From her pocket she produced a small leather case containing what she euphemistically called her inspection aids. A set of tools that looked suspiciously like the lockpicks I'd seen in detective movies. "Sometimes," she whispered as she worked on the door, "doing the right thing requires momentarily setting aside the rules. Remember that, but don't ever use it as an excuse." The lock clicked open with surprising ease. Inside, cabin 13 was immaculate, bed perfectly made, surfaces dust-free. Not a single personal item in sight. It looked like a display room never actually inhabited. "No one's staying here," I said, stating the obvious. Grandmother didn't respond. She was staring at the temperature control panel, which was set to 72 degrees despite the Arctic chill of the room. Methodically, she began examining every inch of the cabin, checking under the bed, inside the closet, behind the curtain. Finally, she stood before the full-length mirror attached to the closet door. "Look at our reflection," she said quietly. I stood beside her, seeing nothing unusual at first. Just my gangly teenage frame and her shorter authoritative presence. Then I noticed it. The temperature read out on the digital clock behind us showed in the reflection, but the numbers were different. In the room it displayed 72F. In the mirror it read 32F. Grandmother pressed her palm flat against the mirror. Instead of meeting resistance, her hand passed through as if the glass were water, sending ripples across the reflective surface. "Stay here," she ordered. "If I'm not back in 5 minutes, go get help." Before I could protest, she stepped forward and through the mirror, disappearing entirely. The surface rippled momentarily, then stilled, once again showing only my solitary, terrified reflection. Those were the longest 5 minutes of my life. I counted each second, watching the clock tick from 3:07. Just as I was about to bolt for the door, the mirror's surface rippled again and grandmother stepped back through, her face ashen. "We need to get off this ship," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. Now. We didn't speak until we were back on solid ground, seated in a small cafe several blocks from the port. Grandmother ordered coffee for herself and hot chocolate for me, though the day was blistering hot. "What I'm about to tell you," she began after taking a fortifying sip, "stays between us. It's not in any official report I'll file. Not because I'm breaking rules, but because some truths serve no purpose in bureaucratic records." On the other side of the mirror, she explained, she had found an identical cabin, but frozen, literally frozen, with ice crystals forming on every surface. Sitting at the small desk was a woman in her 80s, elegantly dressed in clothing at least 30 years out of style. She was writing in a leather-bound journal, seemingly unbothered by the freezing temperature. She looked up when I entered, grandmother said, completely unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting company. "You're not the captain," she said to me, "but you'll do." The woman identified herself as Helena Kraft, confirming she was indeed the widow of shipping magnate Henrik Kraft. According to her, she had boarded the ship, then named the Northern Star, in Southampton in 1973, bound for New York. "I never arrived," she told me. Grandmother continued. "There was a storm. Something happened to the ship's instruments. We got lost in a fog that shouldn't have been there." According to Helena, when the fog finally lifted, the ship found itself in waters that looked familiar but somehow wrong. The stars at night were slightly out of position. Radio communications brought only stat. When they eventually reached port in what should have been New York, they found a city that resembled it closely, but contained subtle differences that only became apparent over time. She believes, grandmother said, lowering her voice though no one was near enough to hear, that the ship somehow crossed into a parallel world, nearly identical to our own but not quite the same. She's been trying to find her way back ever since, moving from ship to ship, searching for the precise conditions that might reverse whatever happened. The journal contained 50 years of notes, observations of differences between her world and this one, detailed records of weather conditions and astronomical alignments, theories about electromagnetic anomalies and their effects on navigation equipment. The truly chilling part, grandmother said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth, is how lucid she is, how methodical. This isn't the rambling of a delusional mind. It's the work of a brilliant woman faced with an impossible situation, trying to apply logic to the illogical. Before grandmother could ask more questions, Helena had stood up suddenly, cocking her head as if listening to something. "It's happening again," she said. "The conditions are aligned. I can feel it." Grandmother described how the cabin began to vibrate slightly, the temperature dropping even further. "You should go," Helena told me, "unless you want to see how the other side looks." That's when grandmother made her retreat through the mirror. The Aurora Borealis departed New Orleans that evening on schedule. Grandmother's official report noted minor discrepancies in the passenger manifest, attributed to clerical error. Cabin 13 was listed as unoccupied, reserved for maintenance. 3 days later, news reached the Port Authority. The Aurora Borealis had encountered an unexpected dense fog bank in the Caribbean, unusual for that region in summer. For 6 hours, all communication with the vessel had been lost. When contact was re-established, everything seemed normal, though the ship was significantly off course. A week after that, my grandmother received a small package at her office. Inside was a vintage fountain pen with the initials HK engraved on its gold band. Wrapped around it was a note on expensive stationery. "Thank you for believing me. I found my way home. The differences here are small but precious. Henrik is still alive in this version. Whether this is my original world or yet another variant hardly matters now. Perhaps someday I'll find you on this side of the mirror, Helena." Grandmother kept the pen in her desk drawer. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I would catch her holding it, turning it over in her hands with a thoughtful expression. "Do you believe it?" I asked her once. About parallel worlds and crossing between them. She considered the question carefully before answering. "What I believe," she said finally, "is that the universe is far stranger than our small minds can comprehend. The borders between what's possible and impossible are as shifting as fog, and sometimes, just sometimes, people find unexpected doors." She never mentioned Helena Craft again, but she developed a curious habit after that summer. Whenever she passed a mirror, she would pause briefly, studying the reflection with unusual intensity, as if looking for subtle differences, or perhaps waiting for ripples.
The year was 1952, and my Uncle Roy was working as a ticket agent for Pan American Airways at the San Francisco International Airport. In those days, commercial air travel was still something of a luxury. Passengers dressed in their finest clothes, and the experience maintained an aura of glamour that's hard to imagine in today's cramped cabins and security checkpoints. People forget, Uncle Roy would tell us during our annual fishing trips to Lake Tahoe, that flying was once magical. Not just the technology of it, though that was miracle enough, but the whole experience. It was like stepping into another world where everyone was important. Uncle Roy had a way of speaking that made even the most ordinary observations feel significant. His voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen the extraordinary hiding within the everyday. Perhaps that's why, of all his stories from 30 years with the airline, the one we requested most often was simply called The Passenger. It was a Tuesday evening in November. He would begin, settling back in his chair beside our campfire, flames casting dramatic shadows across his face. The kind of evening where fog rolls in from the bay like nature's own curtain call, wrapping the runways in a gauze that makes the ground lights look like they're floating in nothingness. Flight 8023 to Tokyo was scheduled for an 11:40. In those days, international flights were major events, with extensive preparation and meticulous passenger management. Uncle Roy was working the ticketing desk, processing the last few travelers when she arrived. When you work with the public long enough, he'd say, you develop a sixth sense about people. Most blur together. Businessmen with their briefcases, families with their matching luggage, honeymooners with their barely contained excitement. But sometimes someone walks in who just feels different. The woman who approached his counter 15 minutes before final boarding was, by his description, unremarkable in appearance. Mid-30s. Conservatively dressed in a navy blue suit, carrying a single small suitcase. Her ticket and passport were in perfect order, identifying her as Eleanor Pritchard, a librarian from Seattle making her first journey to Japan. There was nothing obviously unusual about her, Uncle Roy would insist, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Her clothes were perfectly pressed, her hair immaculately styled, her papers in order. Perhaps it was the very perfection that seemed odd. He processed her ticket and directed her toward the boarding area, expecting that to be the end of their interaction. But as she turned to leave, she looked back at him with an intensity that made him momentarily uncomfortable. She said something that didn't register as strange until much later. Uncle Roy would tell us, leaning forward as if sharing a secret. The longest journeys aren't measured in miles, she told me. They're measured in transitions. With that cryptic remark, she walked toward the gate, disappearing into the crowd of passengers preparing to board. Uncle Roy might have forgotten the encounter entirely if not for what happened 3 hours later. He was preparing to end his shift when his supervisor called him into the office, where 2 men in dark suits were waiting. They identified themselves as federal agents, though they didn't specify which agency they represented. They had that generic government look, Uncle Roy would explain with a small smile. The kind of faces designed to be forgotten as soon as you look away. The agents were interested in Flight 8023's passenger manifest, particularly anyone who might have seemed unusual or last minute. When Uncle Roy mentioned Eleanor Pritchard, their previously professional demeanor shifted subtly. A glance exchanged, a slight tensing of posture. They asked detailed questions about her appearance, her manner, what she had said. Uncle Roy described their interaction, including her strange parting comment about journeys and transitions. The older agent, Harrison was his name, wrote that down verbatim. Uncle Roy would recall. Then he asked if I was absolutely certain those were her exact words. When I confirmed they were, he closed his notebook with a finality that felt ominous. The agents thanked him for his cooperation and left without explanation. Naturally curious, Uncle Roy checked with a friend in the control tower the next morning, only to learn something peculiar. Flight 8023 had reported an unexpected incident during its Pacific crossing. Approximately 4 hours into the flight, at cruising altitude over the northern Pacific, the aircraft had experienced what the pilot described as severe and unusual turbulence, lasting exactly during this brief but violent episode, cabin pressure had fluctuated wildly, oxygen masks had deployed, and most strangely of all electronic systems, including emergency backup systems, had failed simultaneously. In pilot speak, Uncle Roy would explain, this was what they called a ghost flight. Those rare, unexplained moments when aircraft seem to slip momentarily outside the normal laws of physics and engineering. When systems were restored and the crew conducted their passenger check, they discovered something impossible. Eleanor Pritchard was no longer on the aircraft. Her assigned seat, 14C, was empty. Her seatbelt unfastened. Her carry-on items remained in the overhead compartment, and the passenger next to her had been asleep during the turbulence, awakening only when the oxygen masks dropped. A thorough search of the airplane confirmed what was already apparent. Uncle Roy would say, his voice dropping dramatically. She had vanished from a sealed aircraft traveling at 35,000 feet over the Pacific Ocean. This was the point in the story where we children would typically interrupt with logical explanations. Perhaps she had gone to the bathroom or moved seats, or somehow been overlooked in the post-turbulence confusion. Uncle Roy would patiently dismiss each theory with the facts as they had been reported to him. The truly bizarre epilogue came 2 days later, when Uncle Roy received a small package at his home address, an address he was certain Eleanor Pritchard could not have known. Inside was a vintage compass, its needle spinning continuously instead of pointing north, and a handwritten note that contained just one sentence. Some transitions require a guide.
The federal agents returned when I reported the package. Uncle Roy would tell us. They confiscated both items and asked me to sign several confidentiality agreements. I never heard about Eleanor Pritchard again, at least not officially. Here Uncle Roy's expression would become thoughtful, his eyes focused on something beyond our campfire. But 6 months later, I was processing passengers for a flight to Buenos Aires, when I saw her again, or someone identical to her, down to the navy blue suit and small suitcase. Before I could say anything, she placed her finger to her lips in the universal gesture for silence, slid her ticket across the counter and moved on. The name on the ticket wasn't Eleanor Pritchard. The passport photo matched the woman perfectly, but identified her as Catherine Mercer, born in Chicago, occupation unlisted. I looked up from the documents, intending to confront her. Uncle Roy would continue, but she was already gone, not just from my counter, but from the entire ticketing area. I checked the manifest later. Catherine Mercer never boarded that flight to Buenos Aires. In the decades that followed, Uncle Roy encountered Eleanor 5 more times, each time under a different name, each time boarding a flight to a different destination, each time vanishing before he could speak to her. The final encounter came just a week before his retirement. She hadn't aged a day, he would tell us, wonder still evident in his voice 30 years later. Same face, same posture, same navy blue suit, but this time she came directly to my counter, even though another agent was. The name on her documents this time was Virginia Hill, and her destination was Anchorage, Alaska. As Uncle Roy processed her ticket, she spoke without looking up. "You've been a good witness, Miss Chambers," she said, using his name though he wore no name tag and had never introduced himself in any of their encounters. Some journeys can only be seen properly from the shore. When he worked up the courage to ask who or what, she smiled in a way that Uncle Roy always described as both ancient and newborn. "I'm a passenger, Mr. Chambers, just like everyone else. The only difference is that I'm aware of the true destination." With that, she collected her boarding pass and walked away. This time Uncle Roy followed at a discreet distance, watching as she proceeded to the gate, handed her boarding pass to the attendant, and walked down the jetway onto the aircraft. Flight 11117 to Anchorage departed on schedule and arrived without incident. All passengers who boarded in San Francisco disembarked in Alaska. Virginia Hill was not among them. "I've spent 40 years trying to understand what I witnessed," Uncle Roy would conclude, poking at our dying campfire with a stick. Was she some kind of government agent, an extraterrestrial observer, a time traveler, or something else entirely? Something we don't have words for yet. He never found answers, but he developed his own theory, which he shared with us only on the last fishing trip before he passed away. "I believe there are people who don't merely travel from place to place," he said quietly. "They travel between layers of reality, places that exist alongside our world, but just beyond our perception." Eleanor, or whatever her real name was, wasn't disappearing from those flights. She was transitioning to her next destination, one that couldn't be found on any airline's route map. Uncle Roy passed away in his sleep 3 months later. Among his personal effects was an envelope addressed to him that had arrived the day before his death. Inside was a vintage compass, identical to the one he'd received decades earlier, its needle spinning continuously instead of pointing north. The enclosed note read simply, "Your transition approaches. You won't need a guide. You already understand the way."
My mother spent her entire career as an archivist for the United States Coast Guard, specifically tasked with preserving and cataloging lighthouse records, logbooks, maintenance reports, keeper journals, and incident reports from America's coastal sentinels. Her office in a converted boathouse on Chesapeake Bay housed thousands of documents dating back to the early 1800s, many of which she was the first person to thoroughly examine in over a century. "Most people think archival work is dry," she would say during her frequent presentations at our school's career days. "They picture dusty papers and endless filing. What they don't understand is that I'm not just preserving documents, I'm preserving voices, experiences, lives that would otherwise be forgotten." Mom approached each fragile logbook or weather-stained report as if it contained not just historical information but the essence of the person who wrote it. She could spend hours with a single lighthouse keeper's journal, tracing their evolving handwriting, noting their observations, not just of maritime conditions, but of their inner lives, their hopes, frustrations, moments of beauty or terror witnessed from their isolated towers. Of all the archives she maintained, none fascinated her more than the records from Meriwether Point Lighthouse, a relatively obscure installation on a rocky promontory of the Oregon coast that operated from 8. What made these records unique was that for nearly 30 years they were maintained by 3 generations of the same family: Augustus Werner, his son Frederick, and finally Frederick's daughter Catherine. The Werner family chronicle, as Mom called it, provided an unbroken narrative spanning from the late Victorian era through 2 world wars to the dawn of the atomic age, all viewed through the lens of one family's experiences, maintaining the same light. But it was Catherine Werner's logs that my mother found most compelling, particularly those covering the period from January to April. Mom's colleagues dismissed these entries as the fanciful musings of an isolated woman, whose family responsibilities had prevented her from pursuing her obvious literary talents. My mother, however, was convinced there was more to Catherine's story. "Listen to this entry," Mom would say, carefully turning the pages of a leather-bound journal during our family dinner discussions. February 3, 1944. The fog returned tonight, bringing with it the same displaced echo I noted last week. The horn sounds, and then precisely 3. The echo returns not from the direction of Matheson Cliffs, as it should, but from the open sea, as if something out there is mimicking our signal. Catherine's subsequent entries documented this acoustic anomaly with scientific precision, measuring the delay between signal and echo, noting weather conditions, sea states, and even barometric pressure reading. Her father, by then elderly and suffering from arthritis, dismissed her concerns as tricks of the wind or reflections off distant vessels. February 17, 1944. Mom would continue reading. "Tonight I witnessed something that defies rational explanation. The fog was unusually dense, visibility less than 20 yards. At 2:17 a.m., I activated the horn sequence as usual. The echo returned at precisely the expected 3, but this time it was followed by a secondary pattern that deviated from our signal. 3 long blasts, instead of our standard 2 short, 1 long pattern. I verified the equipment is functioning normally. These responsive signals are coming from somewhere or something else." What followed in Catherine's log was a methodical attempt to communicate with whatever was generating these counter signals. She established a mathematical pattern to her foghorn blasts, simple sequences based on prime numbers, and documented what appeared to be responsive patterns that completed or complemented her sequence. By early March, Mom explained, Catherine was convinced she was engaged in communication with an intelligent entity hidden within the fog. Her logs become increasingly excited, even as she maintained scientific rigor in her documentation. March 12 brought a breakthrough, recorded in Catherine's suddenly less formal handwriting. "It came tonight. After weeks of our sound-based conversation, I finally saw it, emerging from the fog bank, approximately 400 yards offshore. I cannot adequately describe what I observed, as it seemed to simultaneously resemble a vessel, metallic, approximately 120 feet in length, and something organic with surfaces that shifted and rippled despite the calm sea. Most disturbing was its luminescence, a pale blue-green glow that seemed to emanate not from any external light source, but from within the structure itself. It remained visible for approximately 72 seconds before the fog enveloped it again. Father was asleep. There were no other witnesses. The logs for the following weeks documented Catherine's increasingly elaborate acoustic exchanges with the phenomenon, culminating in what she described as a breakthrough in mutual comprehension on April. Her entry for that date spans 6 pages of densely written text, containing complex mathematical notations, diagrams of sound wave patterns, and attempts to create a shared symbolic language. "I understand now," Catherine wrote, in the passage my mother would always read with particular emphasis. "They are not from elsewhere in our world, but from elsewhere in possibilities, what scientists might call another dimension that vibrates at a frequency nearly matching our own. The fog represents a thinning between our reality. They have been trying to communicate across this barrier for decades,
perhaps centuries, but no one recognized their attempts as anything but natural phenomena. They experience time differently than we do. What is months of interaction for me might be mere minutes in their perception. Catherine's final entry, dated April 7, 1944, was brief and cryptic. They have invited me to see. Father is stable. The new medication has reduced his pain considerably. Mrs. Talbot from the village has agreed to stay with him through the weekend. I have left detailed care instruction. If I do not return, know that I have gone willingly into greater understanding. Catherine Werner never returned to Elwood Point Lighthouse. The official Coast Guard investigation concluded she had likely fallen from the rocks during a storm that hit the coast on April. Her body was never recovered. Her father Frederick insisted until his death 3 months later that they came for her in the fog, though this was attributed to grief and his deteriorating mental condition. What made Catherine's case particularly intriguing to my mother was not just the mysterious circumstances of her disappearance, but what was discovered during the subsequent inventory of the lighthouse. In Catherine's quarters, investigators found dozens of notebooks filled with what appeared to be either a fictional constructed language or an elaborate code, hundreds of pages of non-English symbols, arranged in flowing interconnected patterns that no cryptographer has ever successfully decoded. More significantly, they discovered a sealed metal box hidden beneath a floorboard, containing a device unlike anything that should have existed in 1944, a metal disc approximately 8 inches in diameter, etched with concentric circles of the same unknown symbols that filled Catherine's notebooks. The disc contained no obvious mechanical components, yet multiple witnesses reported that when placed near sources of electromagnetic energy, radios, power cable, even strong flashlight batteries, it would emit a soft blue-green glow and a barely audible hum that seemed to modulate in patterns similar to the foghorn sequences Catherine had documented. The disc was sent to a naval intelligence facility in Washington, my mother would explain, and was never publicly acknowledged again. The official record states it was merely an unusual art object of no significance. My mother's obsession with Catherine Werner's story took an unsettling when a routine excavation for a new Coast Guard facility near the former site of Elwood Point Lighthouse unearthed a peculiar artifact buried approximately 6 feet below the soil line, a metal disc, identical to the one found in Catherine's quarters, bearing the same unknown symbol. Soil analysis and dating techniques suggested the object had been buried for at least 300 years, more than 150 years before the lighthouse was even constructed. The implications are extraordinary, my mother said when she first showed me the classified photographs of the artifact that had been shared with her given her expertise on Elwood Point. Either Catherine Werner had discovered an ancient artifact and created an elaborate fiction around it, or she never completed that sentence, always allowing us to draw our own conclusions. But her personal journals, which I inherited after her passing last year, reveal how deeply she had pursued the mystery. She had tracked down distant relatives of Catherine Werner, interviewed elderly residents of the coastal community near the lighthouse, and spent countless hours attempting to decode the symbolic language found in Catherine's notebooks. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to experiment with sound patterns based on Catherine's documented foghorn sequences, using specialized equipment to generate precise acoustic frequencies during foggy conditions along the same stretch of Oregon coastline. Her final journal entry, dated just 3 days before she died of an apparent heart attack, while alone at our family's beach cottage, contains a single sentence: "The fog comes tonight, and they have answered my call." When we cleared out her cottage, we found her recording equipment set up on the balcony facing the sea, the digital display still active, cycling through a sequence of tone. The final recording in the device's memory contained 3 minutes of dense fog sounds, followed by what audio engineers have identified as a manufactured echo pattern inconsistent with natural acoustic phenomena. I've since taken up my mother's research, though more cautiously than she approached it. The symbols from Catherine's notebooks now cover one wall of my study, and on foggy nights, I sometimes find myself drawn to the window, listening intently for echoes that return from impossible direction. Not because I believe I will contact whatever entities Catherine Werner and possibly my mother encounter, but because I've come to understand an essential truth that both women discovered. Some lighthouses don't just guide ships through physical darkness. They illuminate passages between different forms of existence, standing sentinel at the permeable boundaries of reality itself. And sometimes, if we pay careful enough attention, we might catch glimpses of what lies beyond those boundaries, calling to us through the fog of our limited perception.
My Aunt Vivian spent 43 years as a broadcast engineer for radio stations across the Midwest, starting in the days when vacuum tubes were cutting-edge technology and continuing well into the digital era. While other engineers specialized in either the technical maintenance of equipment or the practical aspects of broadcasting, Aunt Viv excelled at both, her hands equally comfortable soldering delicate circuits as they were adjusting sound levels during a live transmission. Radio isn't just technology, she would tell me during the summers I spent apprenticing at her station in rural Minnesota. It's the confluence of science and magic, electromagnetic waves carrying human emotion through solid walls across vast distances, connecting minds without bodies ever meeting. It was this philosophical approach to her work that made Aunt Viv exceptional at her job and brought her to the attention of Westward Communications in 1976. When they were constructing what was meant to be their flagship station in the small but growing community of Millards Creek, Iowa. WPRT-AM was built with the latest technology, a 50,000-watt clear channel station, designed to broadcast across 6 states during nighttime hours when AM signals travel farther. The station occupied a purpose-built facility on a hilltop 3 miles outside town, its 3 massive transmission towers forming a triangle around the main building, their red warning lights creating a constellation visible for miles after sunset. They spared no expense, Aunt Viv would recount, showing me the original blueprint framed on her study wall. German mixing boards, Japanese microphones, equipment that most major market stations would envy. All this for a town of barely 8. The reason for such investment soon became clear. Millards Creek sat at a unique geographical and electromagnetic nexus. Something about the combination of mineral deposits in the underlying bedrock, the specific altitude, and the area's unusual lack of natural or man-made interference created what radio engineers called exceptional propagation condition. During test broadcasts before the official launch, WPRT's signal was received as far away as Montreal to the northeast and Albuquerque to the southwest. Extraordinary reach for a regional AM station. More unusual still, listeners in those distant locations reported exceptional clarity, as if the broadcasts originated from just down the street rather than hundreds of miles away. The investors were ecstatic, Aunt Viv would say, pouring another finger of bourbon as she settled deeper into her storytelling. They envisioned WPRT becoming a cultural powerhouse, attracting national advertisers willing to pay premium rates for access to such an expansive audience. The station was scheduled to officially launch on October 15, 1976, with a 16-hour inaugural broadcast featuring local dignitaries, regional musical acts, and nationally syndicated programming. As chief engineer, Aunt Viv spent the final week before launch working 18-hour days, fine-tuning equipment and running transmission tests during the FCC-designated experimental hours between midnight and... It was during one of these late-night tests that she first encountered what she would later call the anomaly. It was around 3:17 a.m., she would say, her voice dropping slightly as it always did when the story reached this point. I was running a standard test pattern, a series of calibrated tones followed by a voice identification of the station's call letters and location. Basic procedure to verify signal clarity and range. After completing the test, protocol required her to switch to monitoring mode to verify the transmission quality. As she listened through the professional-grade headphones, she heard the test tones play back perfectly, followed by her voice announcing, "This is WPRT AM, Millards Creek, Iowa, conducting transmission testing." And then something impossible happened. After a brief silence, her monitoring equipment picked up a response. "Receiving you clearly, WPRT. Please confirm your temporal coordinates." The voice was male, with an accent she couldn't quite identify, somewhere between Midwestern and Canadian, but with unfamiliar cadences. Most disturbing was that it was coming through on WPRT's exact broadcast frequency, which should have been impossible since they were the only station authorized to use that frequency within a... My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, perhaps a ham radio operator with equipment powerful enough to override our signal, Aunt Viv would explain. So I followed standard procedure for signal intrusion. She keyed the microphone and issued the formal warning. "This is WPRT AM,
a licensed station of the Federal Communications Commission. You are transmitting illegally on a protected frequency. Please identify yourself and cease transmission immediately. The response came back instantly. This is also WPRT-AM, operating under International Broadcast Authority License 4578. Confused but intrigued, Antviv decided to engage. I don't recognize the International Broadcast Authority. This is October 12. To whom am I speaking? After a brief silence. Understood. This is Daniel Northcutt, Chief Communications Officer for Millards Creek Township. Today's date here is October 12. I believe we are experiencing a cross-temporal transmission anomaly. I nearly fell out of my chair. Antviv would always say at this point in the story. Either this was an elaborately planned hoax, or I was communicating with someone claiming to be broadcasting from 50 years in the future, using the same station, same frequency, from the same location. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. The man, identifying himself as Northcutt, explained that in his time, WPRT still existed but had evolved into what he called a community emergency broadcast center rather than a commercial radio station. He claimed that unusual solar flare activity had been affecting their transmission equipment, and they had detected temporal echoes of earlier broadcasts during system diagnostics. We've been picking up fragments of transmissions from various points in the station's history, he explained. Mostly just static and partial sentences. This is the first time we've established clear two-way communication across the temporal divide. When Antviv asked for proof he was indeed from the future, Northcutt offered 3 verifiable predictions. A major blizzard would hit Millards Creek on December 4, 1976, collapsing the roof of the high school gymnasium. Ronald Reagan would defeat Jimmy Carter in the 1980 presidential election. And most specifically, WPRT's middle transmission tower would be struck by lightning on April 17, 1977, requiring extensive repairs. I wrote everything down, Antviv would say. Not because I believed him, but because good engineers document anomalies, no matter how implausible. As 5 Suran AM approached the end of their authorized testing period, Northcutt explained that their temporal window was closing as the ionospheric conditions changed with approaching dawn. Before we lose contact, he said, his voice beginning to fade beneath increasing static, you need to know why we've been attempting to reach you specifically. On January 23, 1977, you will discover a serious design flaw in the station's primary transmitter cooling system. In our timeline, you ignored early warning signs, resulting in a catastrophic fire that killed 3 people and destroyed the station. You must prevent this. Look for irregular temperature fluctuations in transmitter cabinet 3. The solution involves his voice cut out completely, replaced by the normal background static of the AM band. Shaken, Antviv documented the entire exchange in the station's engineering log, but told no one, fearing for her professional reputation. She did, however, mark her calendar for the 3 prediction dates Northcutt had provided. The blizzard came exactly as predicted, she would tell me, her eyes distant with the memory. 2 feet of snow and the gymnasium roof collapsed during what would have been a basketball game if it hadn't been cancelled due to weather. The local paper called it the worst December storm in 50 years. Still, she remained skeptical, considering it possible that her mysterious correspondent might simply have had access to long-range weather forecasts, not available to the general public. The real test would come in April with the predicted lightning strike. On April 17, 1977, thunderstorms were indeed forecast for the area. Antviv arranged to be at the station, ostensibly catching up on maintenance work. At precisely 9:42 p.m., during a severe lightning cell that passed directly overhead, the middle transmission tower took a direct hit that overwhelmed its grounding system, causing substantial damage to the connected equipment. That was when I knew, she would say, solemnly. However impossible it seemed, I had communicated with someone who knew future events with perfect accuracy. She immediately began a thorough inspection of the transmission cooling system, focusing on cabinet 3 as Northcutt had specified. After several days of testing, she discovered the flaw, a design error in the automatic shutdown procedure that would prevent the cooling system from activating properly during certain types of power fluctuations, potentially allowing the transmitter to overheat to dangerous levels. It was subtle, she would explain, sketching the faulty circuit on whatever was handy as she told the story. Nothing that would appear during normal operations or even standard testing protocol, but under very specific conditions, the kind that might occur once in a decade. It would fail catastrophically. Aunt Viv documented the flaw and designed a modification that she presented to station management as a precautionary upgrade, based on her years of experience. The modification was implemented in early January 1977, weeks before the January 23rd date Northcutt had mentioned. I never heard his voice again, Aunt Viv would conclude, despite many nights spent monitoring the frequency during the experimental broadcast hours. Whatever cosmic alignment had allowed our transmission window never recurred, or at least never when I was listening. Reagan's election victory in 1980 confirmed the final prediction, removing any lingering doubts about the authenticity of her experience. Aunt Viv remained at WPRT for 12 more years before moving on to finish her career at Minnesota Public Radio. As far as she knew, the modified cooling system operated flawlessly throughout the station's existence. Only once did she attempt to research Daniel Northcutt, driving to Millards Creek's town hall to discreetly inquire whether the name appeared in any municipal records. It did not, but as she was leaving, she noticed a school photograph on the wall of honor showing academic competition winner. Among them was a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, identified as Daniel Northcutt, regional science fair champion. Time is more permeable than we realize, Aunt Viv told me during our final conversation before pancreatic cancer took her just 3 months after diagnosis. We think of it as flowing in one direction, but it's more like an ocean with currents and eddies, places where the surface can fold back upon itself under rare conditions. She left me her engineering logbook containing the detailed notes from that extraordinary night, along with schematics for the cooling system modification that may have saved 3 lives. I keep it in my office alongside the newspaper clipping from December 5, 1976, headlining the gymnasium roof collapse, and another from April 18, mentioning the lightning strike at the local radio station. Sometimes late at night, I tune an antique AM radio to WPRT's old frequency, which now carries a Spanish-language station from hundreds of miles away. During thunderstorms when atmospheric conditions create unusual propagation effect, I listen carefully between the words and music for voices that might be reaching across that temporal divide, messages from a past or future trying to protect us from tragedies we haven't yet recognized are coming.
Every family has its keeper of secrets, the person who somehow becomes the repository for confidences, regrets, and unspoken truths. In our family, that role belonged to my cousin, Eleanor, who served for 32 years as a night nurse at Greenlawn Memorial Hospital in rural Vermont. Something about her presence, a combination of compassionate eyes, unshockable calm, and absolute discretion, invited confessions from patients and relatives alike. Especially in those vulnerable hours between midnight and dawn, when the human spirit is at its most fragile and honest. Night nursing isn't about medicine, Eleanor would say when we gathered at her lakeside cabin for the annual family reunion. Not primarily, anyway. It's about bearing witness. People need to know they're not alone in the darkness, both literally and metaphorically. Though Eleanor kept most patient confidences to herself, she collected and sometimes shared stories of a different sort. Encounters she called threshold experiences that occurred in that liminal space between life and death, wakefulness and sleep, the explainable and the mysterious. These accounts became known in our family as the Night Collector's Archive. Stories reserved for late evenings after younger family members had gone to bed. The story that affected me most profoundly, the one I requested whenever it was my turn to choose, concerned an elderly patient named Howard Parkins, who was admitted to Greenlawn in the winter of 1994 with late-stage congestive heart failure. The doctors had given him weeks, perhaps only days, and he'd been assigned to the quiet corner room reserved for palliative care cases. He was 92, Eleanor would begin, the firelight casting dramatic shadows across her still beautiful face, but so vibrant in spirit that you'd forget his age within minutes of conversation. A retired history professor who taught at Dartmouth for nearly 4 decades. His body was failing him, but his mind remained extraordinary. Howard had no living family. His wife had passed 15 years earlier, and their only son had died in Vietnam. He had outlived his generation of friends and colleagues, becoming what Eleanor called a living archive himself, the last repository of memories no one else retained. During her night shifts, Eleanor would often spend her break periods sitting with Howard, listening to his stories about growing up during the Great Depression, his service in World War, and his passion for medieval European history, particularly the intricate illuminated manuscripts monks had created before the invention of the printing press. Those manuscripts were more than books, Howard had explained to her. They were vessels that captured and preserved light in an age of darkness, each one a small miracle of persistence, each page evidence that someone believed knowledge was worth preserving, no matter how arduous the task. About a week after his admission, Howard began asking Eleanor to bring him empty notebooks, the standard spiral-bound kind available in the hospital gift shop. He also requested a variety of colored pens, explaining that he wanted to record some memories before they disappeared along with him. I assumed he was writing a memoir, Eleanor would tell us. Something to donate to the university archives, perhaps. Each night when I came on shift, he'd have filled dozens of pages with his small, precise handwriting. He kept the notebooks stacked on his bedside table, their number growing steadily. One night, Eleanor arrived to find Howard unusually agitated. Typically stoic about his declining condition, he gripped her hand with surprising strength as she checked his vital sign. "I'm not finishing fast enough," he said, his breathing labored despite supplemental oxygen. "There's too much to record, and I can feel the end approaching." Eleanor assured him that he seemed stable, that he still had time, but Howard shook his head with the certainty of someone who had developed an intimate awareness of his body's failing systems. "I need to show you something," he said, gesturing toward the growing stack of notebooks. "You've been kind to me, Eleanor. You listen. I think you might understand." He asked her to bring him the topmost notebook, which she did. Opening it to a random page, he turned it toward her. Eleanor expected to see the memoir she had imagined, perhaps passages about his childhood or reflections on his academic career. Instead, the page contained what appeared to be elaborate shapes and symbols drawn in various colored inks, concentric circles intersecting with precise angle, mathematical formulas integrated into artistic patterns, and text in what looked like multiple languages, some of which she didn't recognize. "This isn't a memoir," Howard explained, his voice strengthening with intensity despite his physical weakness. "It's a reconstruction, an attempt to recreate something I've carried with me for 70 years. According to Howard, during his military service in 1944, his unit had been temporarily stationed near the French-German border in a small village that had been badly damaged during combat operations. While helping clear a partially collapsed monastery, Howard discovered a hidden chamber that had remained sealed for what appeared to be centuries. Inside was a single item, an unusual manuscript, unlike any he had seen before or since, despite his subsequent career studying medieval texts. The manuscript contained no conventional writing but rather page after page of intricate diagrams, symbols and mathematical notations intertwined with artwork of extraordinary detail and beauty. He described it as knowledge encoded in a form beyond language, Eleanor would tell us, her voice filled with wonder even after decades of repeating the story. He said that looking at those pages was like seeing thoughts rather than reading words. Military protocol required turning over any discovered artifacts, but something about the manuscript compelled Howard to spend one night studying it before reporting his find. He claimed that as he examined the pages by lamplight in his temporary court, something extraordinary happened. The designs began to impress themselves directly into his memory, as if the manuscript was designed not just to be read, but to be absorbed, transferring its content directly from page to mind. The next morning, the monastery suffered a direct artillery hit. Eleanor continued. The hidden chamber and the manuscript were destroyed completely. Howard was devastated, believing this incredible artifact of human knowledge had been lost forever, until he began to realize that he could recall every page, every diagram,
every intricate pattern with perfect clarity, as if the manuscript had somehow copied itself into his consciousness. For years after the war, Howard attempted to recreate what he had seen, but his artistic skills were inadequate to the task. He pursued his academic career, married, raised a son, and tried to convince himself that his experience with the manuscript had been some kind of hallucination born of war stress and exhaustion. But as he aged, Eleanor would explain, the images became increasingly vivid rather than fading. After his retirement, he began experiencing what he called downloads. Periods where complete pages of the manuscript would appear in his mind with absolute clarity, demanding to be transcribed. The notebooks beside his hospital bed represented his attempt to finally honor this decades-long mental burden to extract and preserve what he had been carrying since that night in 19. "I don't fully understand what this is," he told Eleanor, "but I know it's important. There's knowledge here that doesn't exist anywhere else. Knowledge that was nearly lost once already. I can't let it disappear again." As his condition deteriorated over the following week, Howard worked with increasing urgency, filling notebook after notebook with complex diagrams and equations. Eleanor arranged for additional supplies, and occasionally helped steady his hand when his strength wavered, though she understood nothing of what he was recording. On what turned out to be his final night, Eleanor would say, her voice softening as the story reached its most affecting passage, "I came into his room around 3 a.m. to check his vital signs. He was sitting up in bed, surprisingly alert, the completed notebook stacked neatly beside him. He'd finished the last one just minutes earlier." Howard took Eleanor's hand and thanked her for her kindness, then made an unusual request. "Would you read some of it back to me? Any page, it doesn't matter which." Though confused by the request, how could she read diagrams and symbols she didn't understand? Eleanor honored his wish. She selected a notebook from the middle of the stack, opened to a random page filled with concentric circles and flowing lines connecting mathematical symbols, and began hesitantly tracing the patterns with her finger. "Something impossible happened then," Eleanor would tell us, her eyes distant with the memory. "As I followed the lines with my finger, words formed in my mind, not as if I was reading them, but as if someone was speaking directly into my thought. A voice explaining concepts I couldn't possibly comprehend, about the relationship between light, gravity and consciousness. Ideas that seemed simultaneously ancient and futuristic." Startled, she looked up to find Howard watching her with tears in his eyes. "You see it too," he whispered. "It wasn't just my imagination. The knowledge transfers to anyone who traces the patterns properly." He explained his theory that the original manuscript had been created by someone, or perhaps multiple people across generations, who had discovered a method of encoding complex information in a form that bypassed conventional language, communicating directly with the human mind through visual patterns that activated specific neural pathways. "It's like discovering that we've had the wrong idea about reading all along," Howard said. "We've been using language as an intermediary, when direct mind-to-mind transmission was always possible. We just forgot how to do it." Howard died peacefully in his sleep that night, his life's final act being the preservation of knowledge he had carried for 7 decades. As the only hospital staff member who had formed a relationship with him, Eleanor was asked to help pack his few belongings. The notebooks presented a dilemma, she would admit during our fireside conversation. "Technically, they were personal effects that should have been cataloged and processed according to hospital protocol, but something told me they needed protection. Time to be understood properly, rather than risking dismissal as the ramblings of a dying man." In what she described as the only significant ethical breach of her nursing career, Eleanor made a decision. She documented only 3 notebooks in the official inventory, and quietly took the remaining 17 home with her, hidden in her large nurse's tote bag. "I told myself I would find an appropriate academic recipient," she would say, "someone who might recognize their potential importance. But after examining them more carefully at home, I realized no conventional academic would know what to make of them. They'd be dismissed as curiosity at best, evidence of mental decline at worst." Eleanor spent the next several years trying to understand Howard's notebooks, teaching herself to read them using the technique she had accidentally discovered at his bedside. The process was mentally exhausting, and often left her with migraines, but gradually she began to comprehend fragments of the knowledge they contained. It's like glimpsing an entire library through a keyhole. She described it. I catch concepts about the nature of consciousness, the fundamental structure of reality, and methods of perception beyond our conventional senses. But it's like trying to understand quantum physics when you've only mastered basic arithmetic. I lack the foundation to fully grasp what I'm accessing. 5 years after Howard's death, Eleanor received an unexpected letter from an organization calling itself the Custodians of Transferred Wisdom, with an address in Geneva, Switzerland. The letter made no specific mentions of Howard or the notebooks, but spoke of recovered perceptual texts, and Eleanor's guardian role in their preservation. We would be grateful for an opportunity to discuss your stewardship of materials similar to those in our collection, the letter concluded, providing a secure contact protocol that seemed unnecessarily elaborate for normal academic correspondence. After months of cautious communication, Eleanor arranged to meet a representative from the organization, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s who introduced herself simply as Mary. During their day-long conversation at Eleanor's cabin, Marian explained that the Custodians were a centuries-old private organization dedicated to preserving and studying alternative knowledge transmission methods that operated outside conventional written language. According to Mary, Eleanor would tell us, holding her hands near the fire as if still feeling a chill from the memory. What Howard found was one small piece of a much larger body of knowledge, a perceptual library created by a tradition of scholars and mystics, who had discovered or developed methods of direct mind-to-mind knowledge transfer. These techniques had nearly been lost during various historical purges of unorthodox knowledge, with only fragments surviving in hidden repositories throughout Europe and Asia. The Custodians believed that conventional language, while useful for everyday communication, imposed significant limitations on human thought, essentially forcing complex multidimensional concepts into linear sequential expressions that lost much of their content in the translation. The perceptual texts represented an alternative approach to knowledge preservation that maintained the integrity of complex ideas. After examining Howard's notebooks, Marian confirmed they contained authentic perceptual patterns consistent with known fragments in the Custodians' collection. She offered to take them for integration with their larger archive, but Eleanor, still protective of Howard's legacy, declined, instead accepting an invitation to visit the Custodians' research facility in Switzerland. The facility was extraordinary, Eleanor would tell us in hushed tone, housed in a renovated 16th-century monastery built into a mountainside. Their collection contained hundreds of perceptual texts spanning at least 9 centuries and multiple cultural traditions. Scholars there had developed methods to access these texts more effectively than my crude self-taught technique, using meditative practices and specialized training. Eleanor spent 3 weeks with the Custodians, learning their methods and history. They explained that they operated in secrecy not from any desire to hoard knowledge, but because historical experience had shown that premature exposure of their techniques often led to persecution or exploitation. Their long-term goal was the gradual reintroduction of perceptual knowledge transmission alongside conventional language once humanity developed the scientific framework to understand rather than fear it. Upon returning home, Eleanor made copies of Howard's notebooks for the Custodians' archive, but kept the originals, continuing her study of them for the remainder of her life. She occasionally received correspondence from the organization and twice returned to their facility for further training. I've never fully understood whether Howard was simply an accidental carrier of this knowledge or if he was somehow chosen, Eleanor would conclude as her story neared its end. But I've come to believe that important knowledge finds its appropriate vessels, people who will recognize its value and ensure its preservation, even without understanding exactly why they feel compelled to do so. Eleanor retired from nursing at 65, but continued her role as our family's night collector, gathering and preserving stories that existed at the boundaries of conventional experience. When she passed away at 82, I was named the executor of her estate. In her will, she left specific instructions regarding Howard's notebooks, which she had kept secured in a climate-controlled gun safe in her basement, to be delivered personally to the Custodians according to the protocol contained in the accompanying sealed envelope. They are expecting. 2 months after her funeral, I found myself on a winding mountain road in Switzerland, following coordinates that led to an unmarked stone entrance built into a cliff face. I was met there by an elderly man, who introduced himself as Theo, his eyes lighting with genuine warmth as he accepted the case containing Howard's original notebooks. "Your cousin spoke of you often," he said as he guided me inside the facility, which was exactly as Eleanor had described it. "She believed you might have the aptitude to work with perceptual texts yourself." He led me to a small peaceful room where a single page was displayed under glass, concentric circles and flowing mathematical symbols that looked remarkably similar to Howard's work. "Would you like to try reading it?" he asked. I hesitated, remembering Eleanor's warnings about headaches and mental exhaustion, but curiosity prevailed, and I placed my finger at the starting point Theo indicated, tracing the pattern slowly as I'd seen Eleanor demonstrate. For several seconds nothing happened. Then suddenly, like tuning into a radio station that had previously been static, a voice that was not a voice began forming concepts directly in my mind, bypassing language altogether, showing me rather than telling me something profound about the relationship between consciousness and light. I looked up at Theo in astonishment, and his gentle smile told me everything I needed to know. I had become the next link in a chain of transmissions stretching back centuries, perhaps millennia, part of humanity's longest continuous conversation, conducted in a language beyond word. And so I became our family's second night collector, gathering stories that exist at the threshold of conventional understanding, preserving them until the world is ready to hear them in their fullness. This account is one small piece of that collection, offered now because I believe you, reading these words, might be another potential vessel for knowledge that refuses to be forgotten.
My grandfather Samuel was a structural engineer who specialized in suspension bridges, working for the Department of Transportation during what many consider the golden age of American infrastructure development. His career spanned from the post-war boom of the 1950s through the early 90s, and his name appears in the engineering credits of 17 major bridges across the eastern seaboard. Though most travelers speeding across those spans remain oblivious to the minds that calculated the precise tensions and compressions keeping them safely aloft. A bridge isn't just steel and concrete, he would tell me during the weekends I spent at his cluttered home office in coastal Maine, watching him pore over blueprints and stress calculations. It's a poem written in physics, a declaration that humans can negotiate with gravity and win, at least for a while. This philosophical approach to engineering made Grandpa Sam a favorite consultant on particularly challenging projects, which is how he became involved with the Abernathy Narrows Bridge in 1974. A project that would consume the next 5 years of his life and change his understanding of reality in ways he never anticipated. The Abernathy Narrows separated two sides of the small but historically significant community of Havenport, Rhode Island. For centuries, residents had relied on ferries to cross the half-mile stretch of turbulent water where the Abernathy River meets the Atlantic Ocean. The Narrows were notorious for unpredictable currents, frequent fog banks, and a rocky underwater topography that had claimed dozens of vessels since colonial times. The geological and hydrological challenges were immense, Grandpa would explain, unrolling the original site surveys across his dining room table. The eastern bank featured stable bedrock, ideal for anchoring a suspension bridge, but the western approach was problematic. Layers of unstable sediment atop what appeared to be a fault line that, while not majorly active, had produced micro-tremors every few decades. Despite these challenges, political and economic pressures demanded a bridge. The ferry service had become increasingly unreliable due to the worsening weather patterns of the early 1970s, and Havenport's economy was suffering as businesses and residents found themselves frequently isolated from the mainland. The state commissioned an ambitious design, a single-tower asymmetric suspension bridge with a central span of 2,200 feet. Not record-breaking by global standards, but formidable given the unique environmental challenge. What made the project truly unusual was the experimental dampening system designed to compensate for both the wind shear common to the area and the potential seismic activity from the minor fault line. The dampening mechanisms were revolutionary, Grandpa would say,
eyes brightening as he sketched the system on graph paper. A series of massive hydraulic cylinders filled with a non-Newtonian fluid that could instantly transition from liquid to semi-solid state when sensors detected specific vibration pattern. The technology had been developed for nuclear missile silos to withstand attack, but this would be its first civilian application. Construction began in spring of 19. As chief structural consultant, Grandpa Sam divided his time between his office in Boston and the construction site in Havenport, often staying weekdays at the Lighthouse Inn, a centuries-old converted keeper's house perched on the eastern bluff overlooking the Narrow. It was during his third month on site that he first noticed what he would later call the anomaly. I was conducting a routine inspection of the foundation excavation for the main tower, he recounted during one of our last conversations before vascular dementia began erasing his memory. It was just before sunset, that golden hour when the light gets thick and time seems to slow down. The workers had left for the day, and I wanted to verify some measurements without the distraction of the construction noise. As he descended into the massive excavation pit, using the temporary stairs built into its earthen wall, a strange sensation washed over him, a combination of vertigo and what he described as audio compression, as though all ambient sounds suddenly became muffled and distant. I initially attributed it to fatigue, he explained. 70-hour workweeks will play tricks on your senses, but then I saw something impossible. At the bottom of the pit, in the precise spot where the tower foundation was being prepared, Grandpa Sam saw what appeared to be the ghost of the finished structure. A translucent shimmering outline of the completed tower foundation extending upward into empty air. Through this spectral image he could see the opposite shore, but something was wrong with that view as well. Where there should have been only scattered buildings and the old ferry terminal, he saw a developed waterfront with structures that didn't exist. I stood transfixed for perhaps 30 seconds before the vision faded, he said. I told myself it was an elaborate mirage, perhaps caused by some unusual refraction of light off the water combined with my overtired mind projecting the bridge I'd been visualizing for months. He documented the experience in his personal journal but mentioned it to no one, fearing questions about his professional fitness if he reported seeing ghost bridges. He continued his work, and 3 weeks passed without incident. Then, while inspecting the first concrete pour for the foundation during another solitary evening visit, the phenomenon returned stronger this time. The air seemed to thicken around me, he described. The distant sound of waves became muted, replaced by what I can only describe as the acoustic signature of an active construction site: machinery, voices, radios, but with a hollow, echoing quality as though I was hearing it through water. The translucent image of completed structures appeared again, but this time with remarkable clarity. He could see the finished tower foundation upon which he stood, the completed tower rising hundreds of feet into the air, and the main cables stretching across the Narrow. More disturbingly, he could see workers moving on the structure in distinct figures going about their business on a bridge that wouldn't exist for years. I'm an engineer, not given to flights of fancy, Grandpa always emphasized when telling this part of the story. I needed to understand what was happening through rational means, so I did what engineers do. I gathered data. He began carrying a Polaroid camera during his inspections. During his 5th encounter with the phenomenon, he managed to capture 3 photographs. When developed, they showed only the actual construction site, but with strange light artifacts, smeared regions of overexposure that roughly corresponded to where he had seen the spectral structure. More significantly, he began documenting precise measurements during these episodes, using his surveying equipment to record the dimensions of the apparition. What he discovered defied explanation. The ghostly structures he was seeing matched the design specifications exactly down to the centimeter, but with subtle differences in some of the reinforcement layout. Either I was experiencing elaborate hallucinations that perfectly matched our technical drawings, he would say, or I was somehow perceiving the actual bridge as it would eventually be built. Nearly 2 months into these periodic episodes, the phenomenon evolved. During an early morning inspection after a night of heavy storms had delayed construction, Grandpa was measuring moisture levels in the partially completed foundation when the now familiar sensory compression descended. This time, as the spectral bridge materialized around him, he noticed a figure standing at what appeared to be a console or control panel mounted to the completed tower base. A man in work clothes that seemed slightly odd in their cut and material. He was taking readings from instruments I didn't recognize, Grandpa recalled, completely absorbed in his work, just as I had been in mine. On pure instinct, I called out to him. The man jerked upright, clearly startled, and looked directly at my grandfather. His expression transformed from shock to intense curiosity. He said something that Grandpa couldn't hear, then hurriedly adjusted controls on his panel. Suddenly, sound broke through. Receiving this, can you hear me now? The voice was clear but had that same underwater quality as the construction sounds Grandpa had noted in previous episodes. I can hear you, Grandpa replied, heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and disbelief. Who are you? What is happening here? My name is Thomas Ellery, Structural Integrity Supervisor for the Abernathy Preservation Project, the man said. Based on your clothing and equipment, I'm guessing I'm experiencing temporal displacement with someone from the original construction period. Is this It's June 12, 1975, Grandpa responded. You're speaking as though you're from elsewhere. A look of excitement crossed the man's face. It worked. We theorized the reinforcement modifications might create a temporal feedback loop, but this level of coherent communication exceeds our most optimistic projections. He composed himself. Sir, I'm speaking to you from The Abernathy Bridge is currently undergoing its fourth major renovation in preparation for its semi-centennial celebration. That's impossible, Grandpa stated flatly. No more impossible than you appearing as a spectral figure beside equipment that hasn't existed for decades. Ellery countered. We're experiencing a localized temporal overlap facilitated by the unique electromagnetic properties of the non-Newtonian dampening system, combined with the geomagnetic anomalies present in this location. Before Grandpa could respond, Ellery continued urgently. Listen carefully. Our temporal window is likely brief. The original Abernathy Bridge design contained a critical flaw that wasn't discovered until the partial collapse of I need to show you the modified reinforcement pattern that was implemented afterward. Over the next 11 minutes, Grandpa timed it precisely on his watch. Dr. Ellery showed him detailed modifications to the tower foundation and cable anchor designs. The changes were subtle but significant. Additional reinforcement at key stress points, modified angles for certain support structures, and a completely redesigned connection between the tower and the main suspension cables. The original design didn't adequately account for harmonic resonance under specific wind and tidal conditions, Ellery explained. During a nor'easter on October 17, 1987, these forces aligned perfectly to create a catastrophic oscillation pattern. The eastern span failed at precisely 10:47 p.m., during peak winds of 72 miles per hour. As Ellery spoke, the temporal window began to deteriorate. His figure became increasingly transparent, his voice fading in and out. Before the connection was lost completely, he managed to communicate one final critical modification involving the composition of the concrete mix for the tower foundation, an adjustment that would provide crucial additional flexibility during seismic event. Don't dismiss this as delusion, were Ellery's final words before he vanished entirely. 16 lives depend on these changes. The phenomenon ended as abruptly as it had begun. Grandpa stood alone in the early morning light, the half-finished foundation solid and mundane around him. But he had filled 7 pages of his engineering notebook with detailed sketches and specifications of the modifications Ellery had described. I spent the next week in a private crisis, Grandpa told me decades later. Everything I understood about physics and reality insisted what I had experienced was impossible. Some combination of stress, overwork, and perhaps a minor stroke or carbon monoxide exposure from the construction equipment. But the engineer in me couldn't ignore a potential safety issue, no matter how dubiously sourced. He decided on a compromise approach. He would incorporate the modifications into his recommendations, but justify them through conventional engineering logic rather than claiming temporal communication with the future. Over the next month, he methodically revised the existing plans, presenting each change as a logical improvement, based on his decades of experience and some recent academic papers he'd supposedly reviewed. Most of the modifications were approved without significant pushback. They were subtle enough not to dramatically increase costs while clearly enhancing structural integrity. The most substantial change, the concrete composition adjustment, required more convincing, but he eventually prevailed by demonstrating its advantages through computer modeling. Construction continued for 3 more years. During that time, Grandpa experienced the temporal phenomenon and twice more, but never again achieved direct communication with Dr. Ellery or anyone else from the future. He saw only fleeting, silent images of the completed bridge at various stages of its life, including what appeared to be a major renovation project. The Abernathy Narrows Bridge opened to traffic on November 3. Its distinctive single-tower design quickly became a regional landmark, featured on Rhode Island tourism brochures and local business logos. 9 years later, on October 17, 1987, the nor'easter that Dr. Ellery had described hit the eastern seaboard with unprecedented fury. Grandpa, by then semi-retired but still following weather reports with nervous attention, drove through the storm to a hotel near the bridge. As winds reached their predicted peak, he stationed himself at a vantage point where he could observe the structure through high-powered binocular. The bridge danced that night, he recalled solemnly. It swayed and flexed in ways that terrified casual observers, but represented exactly the kind of controlled movement it was designed to make. The modified dampening system performed flawlessly, dissipating energy that would have otherwise accumulated into destructive resonance. The storm passed without incident. The next morning's inspection revealed no structural damage beyond minor issues, typical after such weather event. Traffic resumed by noon. Grandpa never told anyone the full story until he shared it with me in 2012. After his diagnosis but before his memories began to significantly deteriorate, he showed me his original notebooks, the Polaroids with their strange light artifacts, and newspaper clippings about the bridge's construction and the 1987 storm. "I've spent decades trying to understand what happened," he said, gazing out his study window toward the distant coast. "The best explanation I've formulated is that consciousness can sometimes slip between the cracks of time, when certain physical conditions create what amounts to a temporal lens, a convergence of electromagnetic, geologic, and material factors that briefly allows perception and even communication across decades." He died in 2014, never knowing if his experience was genuine temporal communication or an elaborate delusion that coincidentally led to important structural improvement. I inherited his papers, including a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it until October 17, 2027. 40 years after the storm that didn't destroy the bridge. I've visited the Abernathy Narrows Bridge several times since his passing. It's been renovated twice now, most recently standing at the base of the single tower. I sometimes feel a slight pressure in my ears, a subtle muffling of the traffic noise above, probably just the complex acoustics of the structure, but perhaps something more. On my last visit, I noticed a small plaque near the maintenance access door that wasn't there before. It acknowledged the engineers responsible for the original design and subsequent major renovations. Among the names listed under 2027 Semicentennial Restoration was Dr. Thomas Ellery, Structural Integrity Supervisor. The plaque's installation date was listed as May 28, 2025. Still 2 years in my future, but apparently already part of someone else's past. I've marked my calendar for October. Whatever is in my grandfather's sealed envelope, I suspect it will either confirm him as one of history's most unusual prophets, or reveal the elaborate self-deception of a brilliant mind. Either way, I plan to be standing at the base of the bridge's tower that day, watching carefully for any momentary thinning in the fabric of time.
My mother Elizabeth devoted 27 years of her life to the preservation and operation of historic lighthouses along the Oregon coast, beginning as a tour guide at Cape Disappointment during her college summers and eventually becoming the regional preservation coordinator for the Pacific Maritime Heritage Foundation. While others in her field focused on the architectural significance or historical context of these structures, Mom's passion centered on the optical systems, the intricate arrangement of prisms, lenses, and mirrors that transformed a simple flame into a life-saving beacon, visible for miles across treacherous waters. "A lighthouse lens isn't just glass and brass," she would explain as we restored antique Fresnel lenses in the workshop behind our coastal home. "It's a piece of functional art that bends physics to a humanitarian purpose. gathering light and giving it both direction and meaning. Her reputation for restoring historic optical systems to their original brilliance brought her to the attention of the Department of Interior when they were planning the controversial rehabilitation of the Meriwether Point Lighthouse, a structure whose troubled history and remote location had left it abandoned for nearly 40 years. Situated on a rocky promontory 23 miles north of Florence, Oregon, the Meriwether Point Lighthouse had been constructed in 1889 to guide ships past a treacherous reef system that had claimed 18 vessels in the preceding decade. Unlike most West Coast lighthouses built during that era, Meriwether Point featured unusual architectural elements, a hexagonal tower rather than the typical cylindrical design, and an extended gallery that wrapped fully around the lantern room, creating a distinctive silhouette against coastal skies. The truly remarkable feature, though, was the optical system. Mom would often say, carefully unfolding the fragile original blueprint she'd discovered in the National Archives. It was one of only 7 first-order hyper-radiant Fresnel lenses ever manufactured by Saint Gobain Glassworks in Paris, and the only one installed in North America. These massive optical marvels stood over 12 feet tall and contained 624 precisely shaped prisms arranged in concentric rings around a central light source. The hyper-radiant design represented the pinnacle of 19th century optical engineering, larger and more powerful than the standard first-order lenses typically reserved for the most significant coastal beacons. What made Meriwether's lens truly unique was the experimental blue-tinted central dioptric panels. Mom explained during a presentation I attended at the Maritime Museum when I was 15. The blue-tinted panels were intended to make the light distinguishable from other nearby lighthouses even in poor visibility. But according to keeper logbooks, they created some unexpected optical properties that were never fully documented. Those unexpected properties may have contributed to the lighthouse's troubled history. From its earliest days, Meriwether Point experienced an unusually high turnover of keepers, many requesting transfers after less than a year of service despite the higher pay offered for the isolated posting. Logbooks recovered from the station contained increasingly strange entries, particularly from the night watches, with keepers describing secondary illumination phenomena, temporal echoes in the light beam, and visible disturbances in the air surrounding the lens during rotation. By the 1940s, the lighthouse had earned a reputation within the lighthouse service as a disquieting assignment. After automation in 1953, maintenance workers reported similar experiences, with one technician refusing to return after writing an incident report describing violations of normal light propagation and sounds emanating from the lens assembly itself. The lighthouse was decommissioned in 1963, when modern navigation technology made many such facilities obsolete. Unlike other historic lighthouses that found second lives as museums or tourist attractions, Meriwether Point's remote location and unsettling reputation left it neglected until the early 2000s, when changing attitudes about maritime preservation led to reconsideration of its historical significance. It's the last intact hyper-radiant lens in the Western Hemisphere, Mom argued in her proposal to the Department of Interior. Whatever its history, it represents a unique piece of optical and maritime heritage that deserves preservation. Her reputation and passion won the day. In spring of 2003, she was appointed project director for a 2-year restoration effort that would stabilize the tower structure, restore the keeper's quarters, and most importantly, refurbish the massive optical apparatus to working condition for occasional ceremonial lighting. I had just finished my first year of graduate studies in physics at the University of Washington when Mom invited me to join the restoration team for the summer months. Your theoretical background might be useful in understanding some of the lens's unusual properties, she said during our weekly phone call. Besides, when will you get another chance to work with one of the rarest optical devices ever created?
I arrived at Meriwether Point on a surprisingly clear June morning after a 4-hour drive from Portland and a final 7 miles on an unpaved Forest Service road. The lighthouse stood in stark contrast to my expectations rather than the picturesque white tower of postcards. Meriwether presented as a weathered hexagonal column of gray granite rising from a cluster of dilapidated outbuildings. The gallery level and lantern room at its summit were encased in scaffolding and protective tarps that snapped sharply in the constant coastal wind. Mom greeted me with a tight hug before introducing me to the small restoration team. 2 architects specializing in historic structures, a master stonemason, an electrical engineer overseeing power system modernization, Hiroshi Nakamura, an optical physicist from the Smithsonian, who would collaborate with Mom on the lens restoration. The structural work is proceeding on schedule, Mom explained as she led me up the 16-7 steps of the spiral staircase to the lantern room. But we've encountered some peculiarities with the optical system that go beyond normal deterioration. The lantern room had been cleared of the protective panels that normally surrounded it, leaving only the skeletal iron framework supporting a temporary roof. This allowed unobstructed views of the Pacific stretching to the horizon on 3 sides. In the center of the space stood the massive hyper-radiant lens, partially disassembled with many of its prism panels removed and carefully stored in custom-built crates. Even in its incomplete state, the lens was breathtaking. A 12-foot-tall bronze and brass framework designed to hold hundreds of precisely shaped crystal prisms in concentric circles around what would have originally been an oil lamp but had been converted to an electric light source in the night. We've documented significant prismatic degradation in the blue-tinted panels, Dr. Nakamura explained, handing me a magnifying loupe. But the nature of the degradation doesn't match any known pattern of saltwater exposure, thermal stress, or standard aging process. Through the loupe, I examined one of the blue panels that had been removed from the assembly. The glass showed unusual patterns, not the typical clouding or cracking one might expect from century-old glass, but something that resembled interference patterns, as though the molecular structure of the glass itself had been reorganized in subtle ways. The patterns emerge most clearly under ultraviolet examination, Mom added, switching on a handheld UV light. Under the purple glow, the glass revealed complex geometric patterns that resembled nothing so much as diffraction gratings, the kind used in spectroscopy to separate light into its component wavelength. These patterns don't appear in any of the manufacturing documentation, Dr. Nakamura said. St. Gobain's records are meticulous, and they indicate the blue tint was achieved through the addition of cobalt oxide to the glass mixture, a standard technique that shouldn't produce structural changes of this nature. Could it be some kind of crystallization process occurring over time? I asked, my physicist's mind already considering possibilities. That was our first hypothesis, Mom replied, but crystallization would follow nucleation patterns determined by molecular structure and environmental conditions. These patterns are too uniform, she hesitated, intentional. Dr. Nakamura nodded in agreement. It's as though someone deliberately altered the glass at a microscopic level, creating what amounts to thousands of tiny diffraction gratings throughout the material. But the technology to make such precise alterations didn't exist it barely exists now. Over the next several weeks, I divided my time between helping with the general restoration work and assisting Mom and Dr. Nakamura with their increasingly fascinating investigation of the lens's optical properties. We carefully documented each prism panel, mapping the mysterious patterns and testing how they affected light transmission under various conditions. What emerged was astonishing. The patterns in the blue panels created complex interference effects that seemed to alter not just the direction and intensity of light passing through them, but sometimes its spectral characteristics as well. Under certain conditions, particularly during sunrise and sunset when the light contained specific proportions of wavelength, the refracted beam would display colors that shouldn't have been present in the original light source. It's as though the lens isn't just bending the light, Nakamura observed one evening as we conducted experiments with the partially reassembled lens. It's somehow accessing parts of the spectrum that weren't present in the input source. The most dramatic effects occurred during what we came to call the transition times, The brief periods of dusk and dawn when natural light rapidly shifted in color temperature. During these intervals, the beam projected by the lens would sometimes display what appeared to be temporal discontinuities, sections of the light beam that seemed to flicker with patterns distinct from the steady rotation of the lens mechanism. It was during one such session, approximately 6 weeks into the project, that we experienced the first truly inexplicable event. We had installed temporary lighting to simulate the original oil lamp at the center of the lens assembly, and Mom was adjusting the alignment of several recently restored prism panels. Nakamura operated the hand-cranked rotation mechanism that would eventually be converted to electric motor drive, while I documented the beam patterns as they swept across a makeshift screen we had erected on the gallery outside. As the summer sunset reached what photographers call the golden hour, the light passing through the lens took on remarkable properties. The projected beam intensified beyond what our input source should have produced, and the expected circular pattern on our screen began to display intricate internal structures, concentric rings and radial patterns that shifted and pulsed with the rotation. "Are you seeing this?" I called through the open door to Mom and Dr. Nakamura inside the lantern room. "The beam pattern is self-organizing." Before either could respond, a strange auditory phenomenon enveloped the lighthouse. A harmonic humming that seemed to emanate from the lens itself as it rotated. The sound built in complexity, layering overtones and undertones in a manner reminiscent of Tibetan throat singing, but with an unmistakably mechanical quality. The light patterns on our screen intensified further, and then, to my utter astonishment, began projecting what appeared to be coherent imagery, blurred at first, but rapidly resolving into what looked like a view of the same lantern room where Mom and Dr. Nakamura stood, but somehow altered. The furnishings were different. The walls appeared freshly painted rather than in mid-restoration. And most disturbingly, the figures moving within this projected image were not my mother and Dr. Nakamura. I stumbled back into the lantern room to find them frozen in place, staring at the lens with expressions of disbelief. The humming had grown louder, resonating through the iron structure of the tower itself, and the lens, the massive, intricate assembly of glass and brass, appeared to be glowing from within, the blue panels in particular emanating a radiance that couldn't be accounted for by simple reflection or refraction of our light source. "It's happening just like the Keeper logbooks described," Mom whispered, her voice barely audible above the harmonic resonance. "The secondary illumination phenomenon." As we watched, transfixed, the spaces between the prism panels appeared to fill with a misty luminescence, creating the impression that the entire lens was suspended within a glowing cloud. Through this luminous haze, we could see shifting images, as though the lens had become a window looking out on multiple versions of the same lantern room existing in different times or dimensions. In one momentary glimpse, I saw the room as it might have appeared in the 1890s. With oil lamps and a bearded keeper in period uniform making adjustments to the mechanism. In another flash, a version of the room with equipment I didn't recognize, sleeker, more advanced than our contemporary technology. The images flickered and changed with each rotation of the lens, as though we were witnessing a rapid slideshow of the lighthouse's existence across different eras. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon subsided. The humming faded, the glow diminished, and the lens returned to its expected optical behavior. The three of us stood in stunned silence for several minutes before Dr. Nakamura finally spoke. "That," he said with remarkable understatement, "was not standard refraction." Over the following days, we attempted to document and analyze what had occurred, but found ourselves limited by both the available technology and the conceptual frameworks of conventional optics. None of our recording devices had captured the images we'd seen within the lens, only variations in light intensity and unusual spectral distributions that, while anomalous, failed to convey the profound visual experience we had shared. "I've been thinking about quantum superposition," I ventured during one of our evening debriefing sessions. "In quantum mechanics, particles can exist in multiple states, simultaneously until observed or measured. What if the unique properties of this glass somehow allow light, which can behave as both particle and wave, to access quantum states that are normally hidden from macroscopic perception?" Dr. Nakamura, trained in classical optics but familiar with quantum concepts, considered this thoughtfully. "You're suggesting the lens might function as some kind of quantum filter or amplifier?" allowing us to perceive light that exists in superposition across what we experience as time. It would explain why the Keeper logbooks describe temporal echoes in the beam. Mom added they might have been seeing light from different moments in time, overlapping through some quantum mechanical effect we don't yet understand, whether by coincidence or cosmic design. Our breakthrough in understanding came exactly 1 week after the initial event. We had continued our restoration work while conducting controlled experiments during the transition times of dawn and dusk. While the phenomenon hadn't repeated with the same intensity, we had observed minor versions. Brief harmonic sounds from the lens, momentary flashes of unexplained luminescence, and occasional projections of unfamiliar imagery that vanished too quickly to document. On this particular evening, as sunset approached, Dr. Nakamura made a critical observation. The effect seems strongest when the rotation speed reaches approximately 12.7 seconds per revolution. The original mechanical clockwork was designed to produce exactly that rotation period. We adjusted our hand-cranked mechanism to match this speed as precisely as possible, and waited as the golden light of sunset filled the lantern room. Almost immediately the now familiar humming began to build, and the lens took on that inner luminescence we had witnessed before. This time, however, the effect stabilized rather than fluctuating wildly. The projected beam formed a steady image on our screen. A clear view of the lantern room as it might appear, fully restored and operational, with modern equipment seamlessly integrated with the historical element. And standing before the lens in this projection was a woman who, despite being perhaps 20 years older, was unmistakably my mother. Mom gasped as she recognized herself, and the figure in the projection reacted simultaneously, turning toward us with an expression of shock that mirrored my mother's own. For a brief, extraordinary moment, my mother found herself staring at her future self, across what we would later theorize was a quantum bridge created by the unique properties of the hyperradiant lens. Without hesitation, Mom stepped forward and raised her hand toward the projection. Her future self did the same, their fingers appearing to meet at the boundary between present and future. No words were exchanged, perhaps couldn't be exchanged across whatever dimensional barrier separated them, but a look of profound understanding passed between them. The elder Elizabeth then did something unexpected. She held up a notebook, open to a page filled with diagrams and equations, pressing it against her side of the quantum window. My mother quickly grabbed her own notebook and pen, frantically copying what she could see before the connection inevitably faded. The entire exchange lasted less than 40 seconds, before the harmonic resonance began to waver. The luminescence flickered, and the image of the future lighthouse dissolved back into normal beams of light sweeping across our screen. But my mother had managed to copy nearly a full page of information, mathematical formulas, and technical diagrams that appeared to describe the very phenomenon we had just experienced. "This is incredible," Dr. Nakamura breathed, examining the hastily copied note. "These equations combine elements of quantum field theory with classical optics in ways I've never seen before. It's as though someone developed an entirely new theoretical framework for understanding light." "Not someone," Mom corrected quietly. "Me. Or rather, the person I will apparently become." The notes described what was termed a quantum optical resonance field, a condition in which specially configured optical elements could facilitate the temporary overlapping of quantum states that normally remain distinct due to decoherence. According to these theoretical principles, the blue-tinted panels of the Meriwether lens had been deliberately designed to create precisely this effect under specific conditions. Most astonishingly, the notes included a manufacturing date, 2020. "This suggests a closed temporal loop," I said, the implications dawning on me. "The future version of Mom shares information with us now, which presumably leads to the development of this theory, which eventually enables her future self to understand the lens well enough to reach back and provide the information in the first place." "That's assuming I'm the one who develops this theory," Mom pointed out. "Based on the complexity of these equations, it seems more likely I'll be working with a team of theoretical physicists." She gave me a meaningful look, perhaps including one I happen to be related to. The restoration project continued for another 11 months, during which we documented 17 more instances of what we now called quantum optical resonance event. The phenomena never again achieved the clarity of that pivotal interaction between present and future, but each occurrence provided additional data that helped us refine our understanding of the lens's extraordinary property. We discovered that the patterns etched into the blue panels, which our analysis confirmed were not part of the original 1889 manufacture, functioned as microscopic waveguides that facilitated quantum entanglement between photons passing through different parts of the lens system. The specific arrangement created a self-reinforcing resonance that, under ideal conditions of light quality and rotation speed, briefly overcame normal quantum decoherence, allowing macroscopic manifestation of quantum superposition. In practical terms, this meant the lens could sometimes function as a window between different moments in its own timeline, past, present, and future, overlapping in ways that defied conventional physics, but aligned with emerging theories in quantum mechanics. The restoration was completed in late 2004. With the Meriwether Point Lighthouse reopened as both a historical monument and a working navigational aid for ceremonial occasions. What the public wasn't told, what was documented only in a classified addendum to the project report, was that the lighthouse had also become America's first accidental quantum observatory. Mom spent the next 15 years dividing her time between conventional lighthouse preservation and increasingly specialized research into what came to be called temporal optical phenomena. She assembled a small team of unconventional thinkers from diverse fields: quantum physics, optical engineering, information theory, who made regular pilgrimages to Meriwether Point during solstices and equinoxes, when the resonance effects were strongest. In 2019, she published her first peer-reviewed paper on the subject in the Journal of Quantum Optics, co-authored with Dr. Nakamura and myself, by then an associate professor of theoretical physics. The paper, carefully framed to avoid direct references to temporal communication, nevertheless introduced revolutionary concepts about light's potential to carry information across what we delicately termed non-local manifolds of quantum probability. The academic establishment largely dismissed our work as interesting but speculative. A few insightful colleagues, however, recognized its implications and quietly joined our research collective. By 2021, we had secured private funding to establish the Center for Advanced Optical Physics in Florence.
In 2021, we had secured private funding to establish the Center for Advanced Optical Physics in Florence, Oregon, just 20 miles from the Meriwether Point Lighthouse that had become the focus of our unconventional research. The facility was deliberately understated: a converted coastal warehouse with reinforced laboratories, state-of-the-art optical equipment, and computational resources dedicated to analyzing the data we continued to gather from the lighthouse's extraordinary lens. Our team expanded cautiously, adding only researchers who demonstrated both technical brilliance and the philosophical flexibility required to work at the boundaries of established physics. We operated with a peculiar awareness that our most significant breakthroughs might have already occurred in a future we hadn't yet experienced, creating a unique research environment where discovery felt simultaneously like creation and remembrance. Mom, now in her early 60s, had become something of a legend in specialized scientific circles, the lighthouse preservationist who had stumbled upon quantum optical phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of light, time, and observation. Her intuitive understanding of optical systems, combined with decades of hands-on experience with historical lenses, provided invaluable practical insight that complemented the theoretical work of our physicists. The equations she had copied during that pivotal resonance event became the foundation of what we now called temporal field theory, a mathematical framework describing how specially configured optical systems could, under precise conditions, facilitate the temporary alignment of quantum states across different temporal coordinates. The mathematics was beautiful, elegant, and maddeningly difficult to test under controlled laboratory conditions. Which is why, on the winter solstice of 2022, we returned to Meriwether Point with a specially designed experimental apparatus. After nearly 20 years of study, we believed we understood enough about the hyperradiant lens's unique properties to attempt something unprecedented: deliberate initiation of a resonance event with specific temporal targeting. In theory, I explained to our core research team as we assembled the equipment in the lantern room, the quantum signature we're generating should create an attractor state that increases the probability of connecting with the specific future moment we're targeting. December 21st, 2023, Mom said, checking the calibration of our modified light source. Exactly 1 year from today. Dr. Nakamura, now in his 70s but sharp as ever, made final adjustments to the sensor array surrounding the lens. The targeting mechanism depends on quantum entanglement between photons we're generating now and their future states, he reminded us. We're essentially creating a temporary Einstein-Rosen bridge, using light as both the structural medium and information carrier. As sunset approached, the atmosphere in the lantern room grew charged with anticipation. Weather conditions were ideal. Clear skies with precisely the right atmospheric pressure and humidity levels our models predicted would optimize the resonance effect. The ancient mechanism rotated the massive lens at exactly 12.7 seconds per revolution, driven now by a precision electric motor that maintained speed consistency to within 1,000th of a second. The first signs of resonance began right on schedule, the familiar harmonic humming that seemed to emanate from the glass itself, followed by the misty luminescence gathering between the prism panels. But this time, rather than passive observation, we were actively shaping the phenomenon, introducing specific quantum signatures through our modified light source that, if our theories were correct, would help establish a connection to our targeted future moment. The effect built more rapidly than in any previous observation, the blue panels glowing with increasing intensity as the rotation continued. On our monitoring screens, quantum coherence measurements spiked far beyond previous records, suggesting the resonance field was successfully forming. Temporal targeting signature is stabilizing, reported Dr. Eliza Chen, our quantum information specialist, who had joined the team 3 years earlier. Field coherence at 87. The lantern room itself seemed to waver, as though the boundary between present and future was becoming permeable. Through the luminous haze surrounding the lens, indistinct figures began to appear, moving shadows that gradually resolved into recognizable human form. And then, with startling clarity, we found ourselves looking at the same lantern room, but subtly altered equipment we'd never seen before, intermixed with familiar devices, and 5 people staring back at us with expressions that mirrored our own astonishment. I recognized Mom immediately, looking remarkably vital despite the additional year of age. Beside her stood Dr. Nakamura and Dr. Chen, similarly aged by just the single year we'd targeted. The other 2 figures were unfamiliar to me. A young woman with close-cropped silver hair and a tall man whose features suggested indigenous heritage. For several seconds, both groups simply stared at each other across the quantum bridge, the impossibility of the moment rendering us all temporarily speechless. Then, methodically, as though they had rehearsed for this precise scenario, our future counterparts began holding up prepared signs with printed messages. Connection stable, 6:27 p.m., December 21, 2023. Read the first. Directional communication confirmed, stated the second. Mom, my present mom, stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotion visible on her face. We see you clearly. Can you hear us as well? Her future self nodded and spoke, her words carrying across the temporal divide with surprising clarity. We receive you perfectly. We've been preparing for this moment for the past year. What followed was the most extraordinary scientific exchange in human history. A conversation between present and future, spanning exactly 17 minutes before quantum field decay began to degrade the connection. We learned that our future selves had spent the intervening year refining our understanding of the resonance effect and developing more sophisticated methods for stabilizing the temporal connection. Most significantly, they had discovered that the patterns in the blue panels weren't just facilitating quantum superposition, they were themselves a message, encoded by some unknown entity who had modified the original. The patterns form a 3-dimensional encryption key, explained the silver-haired woman,
who introduced herself as Dr. Rebecca Wolf, a cryptologist specializing in geometric information systems. When properly deciphered, they reveal specifications for building what we're now calling a chronometric resonator, essentially a more advanced purpose-built version of what the Meriwether lens does accidentally. Who created the encryption? I asked, the implications sending my mind racing. And when? My future self answered, his expression suggesting he remembered asking this very question a year earlier. That's the most remarkable part. Spectroscopic dating of the etching patterns indicates they were created approximately 40 years from now. We believe someone in that time period modified the lens by reaching back through these same quantum optical principles. The connection began to waver then, the images of our future selves flickering as the resonance field destabilized. In the final moments before communication failed entirely, future mom held up one last message board with a handwritten note. The light connects all frequencies of time. What we build changes what we become. As the quantum bridge collapsed and normal reality reasserted itself, we stood in stunned silence, processing the implications of what we had experienced. Not only had we confirmed the possibility of temporal communication through specialized optical systems, but we had discovered that we were apparently part of a much larger temporal loop, one that extended decades into the future and perhaps centuries into the past. The months that followed were a blur of intense research activity. We meticulously analyzed the data collected during the resonance event, and began the painstaking process of decrypting the patterns embedded in the blue panels, a task that combined advanced mathematics, quantum computing, and intuitive leaps that often came to Mom during her early morning walks along the cliffs near the lighthouse. By late summer of 2023, we had successfully deciphered enough of the encryption to begin understanding the fundamental principles behind the chronometric resonator described by our future selves. The theoretical framework was breathtaking in its elegance, a synthesis of quantum field theory, non-linear optics, and information science that seemed simultaneously beyond our current scientific paradigm yet built upon principles we could recognize. It's like being given the assembly instructions for a quantum computer in 1950. Dr. Chen observed during one of our design sessions. We can understand the individual components, but the integrated system represents a conceptual leap we wouldn't have made independently for decades. On December 21, 2023, exactly 1 year after our first deliberate resonance experiment, we returned to Meriwether Point prepared to receive the communication from our past selves that we now remembered sending. The circular nature of these events no longer seemed paradoxical to us but rather revealed a deeper truth about time's non-linear structure at the quantum level. The resonance occurred precisely as we anticipated, creating a 17-minute window of communication with our past self. We shared our discoveries about the encrypted patterns and the proposed chronometric resonator, watching with a strange blend of déjà vu and wonder, as our past selves reacted with the same astonishment we remembered feeling a year earlier. As the connection began to fade, Mom held up her carefully prepared final message. The light connects all frequencies of time. What we build changes what we become. The phrase had come to her in a dream 3 months earlier, and had subsequently become something of a mantra for our research team. Only as she held it up for our past selves to see did she fully appreciate its recursive significance. She had first encountered these words when her future self showed them to her, creating a self-originating information loop that seemed to transcend conventional causality. When the resonance field collapsed and the connection ended, we knew we had successfully completed one cycle in what appeared to be an extended temporal conversation spanning generations. The encrypted instructions embedded in the lighthouse lens suggested that our work was just beginning, that we were participants in a scientific endeavor that transcended not just disciplinary boundaries but temporal ones as well. In early 2024, we broke ground on a dedicated facility adjacent to the Center for Advanced Optical Physics, a purpose-built structure designed specifically to house the chronometric resonator we had begun constructing based on the decrypted specification. The project drew upon expertise from diverse fields, with specialists in metamaterials, quantum optics, and information theory working alongside glassblowers, precision mechanics, and even artists, whose intuitive understanding of light and form proved surprisingly valuable. Mom, now approaching retirement age by conventional standards but showing no signs of slowing down, oversaw the integration of historical optical elements with cutting-edge technologies. Her decades of experience with lighthouse lenses provided crucial insights into the practical challenges of constructing and maintaining large-scale optical systems designed to operate across extended time frame. Lighthouse lenses were always built to last for generations, she reminded us during a particularly challenging phase of the construction. The original engineers understood they were creating something that would outlive them, that would continue serving its purpose long after they were gone. We're doing the same, just on a more ambitious time scale. As we approach the completion of the first experimental chronometric resonator in early 2025, I find myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that began with my mother's passion for lighthouse preservation and led to what may be the most profound scientific breakthrough in human history. The ability to communicate across time, even within strict limitations of temporal proximity and duration, challenges our most fundamental assumptions about reality and opens possibilities we are only beginning to explore. The question that occupies much of my thinking now is one of intention and responsibility. Why did future researchers, apparently working in 2063, choose to embed their message in a 19th century lighthouse lens? What larger purpose does this temporal communication serve? And what role are we playing in a conversation that spans centuries? Mom, with her characteristic blend of practical wisdom and philosophical depth, offered a perspective that continues to guide our work. Lighthouses have always served dual purposes. They warn of danger, yes, but they also guide travelers home. Perhaps this quantum lighthouse is doing the same across time, warning us about paths we should avoid while illuminating the way toward a future worth creating. As we prepare for the first full activation of the chronometric resonator scheduled for the summer solstice, I can't help but wonder what messages await us from across the light between frequencies, and what echoes of our own voice we might send rippling through time's mysterious depth.